Hello and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
You're listening to episode 16, season 2. I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader in all things CI and CD. Today, I'm joined by Justin Bauer, Chief Product Officer at Amplitude Analytics. Justin, thanks so much for joining me. Excited to have you.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's jump right in. I mean, Amplitude is an organization, a product that I've known for a long time. I always think, I always want to pick a number, but I actually have no idea. I'll start talking about your existence or whatever, but feel like it's been central to certainly our own work at CircleCI and just how we think about product for a really long time. So excited to talk about that. And then, we've been focusing this season on this theme of learning from failure, but then also exploring, are we really failing? Are we just setting up experiments to find the right answer? How do we think about it and talk about it? And certainly, doing that well requires data, which is, right at the heart of what you've been doing. But also really thinking about experimentation. I think there's been a natural evolution in your own product line and your space around that. So to kick us off, can you give us just like the few sentence summary of kind of Amplitude, what you set out to solve, and how maybe that original picture of analytics and data has grown into testing and learning and thinking about experimentation?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's a great topic. I love that this is the focus of the season because I think it's critical for any successful product organization to constantly be testing, learning. That's the bedrock of innovation. I think for us, we really saw an opportunity in the space to help companies do that. As our mission at Amplitude is to help companies build better products through data. And we really felt like there's a lot around kind of the art of building product and the intuition and the vision, and all of that's obviously critically important to building a successful product. But there's also a lot of science behind that as well. How do you ensure that what you're building actually is providing value? How do you figure out, test and experiment around things that are working, not working, so that you can double down on the things that are providing value to users and stop working on the things that aren't? Most product work, unfortunately, most features actually don't provide much value to users. And it's not that as builders, we intended that to happen. It's that we didn't have an opportunity to learn from users fast enough to get that signal. And so analytics is a really critical part of that journey. And so that's really been the focus, the center for us since day one, is helping people understand user behavior, really be at the center of that analytics. And happy to talk about our own kind of experimentation and failures around looking at, what are things that we could go beyond that. But we eventually landed upon experimentation actually being an important part of what our suite could be. And we actually, not surprisingly, took an experimental approach to figuring that out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Experimentation to land at experimentation. I want to come back to that in 1 second because I love it. But one of the other things you mentioned in there that's really been fascinating me lately is this kind of sense of intuition. Like, great products are born because people have a great idea, right? And I think, one of the things that I've talked about a lot in the past, maybe not on this podcast, is stealth mode and this idea that like I have the perfect idea and I'm only going to unveil it, because all that matters is my idea. So I'm going to unveil it when it's perfect. And I'm pretty sure everything you do in your business is about getting it in front of customers as quickly as possible and getting, data and analytics and feedback and truly understanding, how customers are interacting, and like all of these things that we have are not actually interesting. So how do we, I guess, debunk the myth of like the Steve Jobs persona, which is like, I just sit in my office and come up with the perfect thing and, drop it on the world, and get people to think about the other 99.999% of great products that are created through this iteration, experimentation, learning, interacting with customers. Like, what is how do we shift our thinking about that?
It's great. Honestly, the first part of shifting that thinking, I think, is actually talking about how some of the great products that Steve Jobs built wasn't what everyone thinks. Like the story of the iPhone, it's actually quite fascinating to actually take a look at the story of the iPhone. Like the iPhone did not come from this amazing idea that Jobs had, and then he like built it in a basement. It actually came from a series of failures. And a number of them that they learned from. So I know there was the touchscreen tablet project that they initially were working on many years before the iPhone came to be. And actually that ended up being too expensive. And so they canned that. If you really think about the precursor to the iPhone, it was the iPod. But even the iPod originally wasn't a successful product. It didn't take off until they built iTunes for PC, which initially Jobs was like, we're going to do that over my dead body. But it was very clear that's what users wanted.
Yeah.
Then it took off. They then tried to figure out how to put Wi-Fi into the iPod, but then that didn't work because the interface was horrible. And then actually the first phone that Apple built was the Roker. People don't remember that. It was a partnership with Motorola. And that was a huge failure. But as you look at all of these different pieces, you can start to see how all of those learnings eventually led them to realize that it was actually possible to build a phone in the way that eventually became the iPhone.
Right.
I don't think they could have done that without having taken all of those risks and those learnings. And yes, it took vision to actually put all that together. And yeah, they worked for a couple of years in stealth mode to do that, but it actually was off the back of all of these previous learnings. That's the thing that people miss. And that's why experimentation and embracing failure and accepting that as part of the innovation process is so critical.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway from that, and like seeing even how distant some of those things were. Like we're taking a little piece of this, we were centered around music, and then we were centered around the Newton always. I don't know if anyone remembers that product, but and I think that was while Steve was out, but still, like it was a big thing that Apple tried to innovate on, and I'm sure they learned a lot of things from that, right? And so tying all these pieces together, and then sort of having this. I don't even know if then it was kind of an aha eureka moment, but we have a little bit of this and this and this, and we've built all these expertise, skills, knowledge, and now we can tie them together. And to your point, the Windows thing, like we understand what customers are trying to do, and we have an in. Let's not be dogmatic, right? Like no way we're going into that market, but that's where everyone's pulling us. Like how can we use that and then use that to build the thing that we're really trying to build? That's super awesome. So tell us a story about experimenting to experimentation. Like what sort of things were you exploring as a natural extension of analytics that felt right? And then what did you learn, and how did you end up with the experimentation products?
Yeah. So as an analytics company, as you can imagine, there's a lot of use cases. We have a lot of different personas that use us. So there's the traditional kind of PM, but certainly we have lots of engineers that use product analytics. We have lots of designers. We have customer success, customer support, marketing teams. There's a lot of different people that need access to product data. And so as part of that meant there are a lot of areas where we could potentially expand into. The real question for us is like, what's the right adjacency? And so I remember we spun up a small team to explore a lot of various paths. And at the end of the day, we actually went down one. It was exploring some stuff around with engineering because that was a big user for us. So we just weren't getting to value there. And so one, we killed that because we learned there wasn't actually something that was super valuable to them, and the data helped us see that. But also, we also looked at our own data to see what signals within our own product could really help us uncover how customers were hacking Amplitude to solve a problem. And that's actually where experimentation came in. We actually found that a number of our customers were sending in flag data, A/B flags, into Amplitude, even though we didn't have an experimentation offering. And so we actually started asking them why. Like, why are they doing that? You could be analyzing these in the product that you're using. And they started to explain a lot of the problems that they had with existing vendors and how they could solve for those by hacking Amplitude. And those actually all became the core tenets of the experimentation product we built. And it worked quite well because we believe in an open ecosystem. We believe in integrating with other tools, but we actually found that wasn't enough for customers. There needed to you couldn't just get it through a simple integration. We actually solved a lot of problems within the space. And that came from like us uncovering, looking at the data, then releasing versions of that. So we released a very simple A/B test tool that actually saw a lot of success, way more than we expected. That encouraged us to double down. I remember we released a couple things around data storytelling that actually didn't work, so we pulled back on that, and then eventually got to the point where like, okay, yeah, we feel confident this is the thing we want to go down, and then made the commitment to build the experimentation product.
Got it. That's so cool. There's so much in there. Like we talk about experimentation a lot. I mean, people in software, we at CircleCI, I mean, pick any version of we there. And I certainly personally think a lot about design of experiments. Like, how do I build a great experiment knowing I'm going to get a good, valuable outcome? But in this case, you're talking about such a strong signal from your customers that you didn't have to build the first experiment. It's like, look, everyone is trying to do this. Like, there's so much available to learn in how your product is like tangentially meeting the needs of your customers, so close that they're like going out of their way to turn it into the thing that they need. Like, that amount of pull is super valuable as a product designer, an entrepreneur, however you want to think about it. And, ignore it at your peril is what I would say, because someone else is going to solve that problem if you're not doing it. Right. And so that, like, especially when those of us building tools for other application builders, developers, like, they have the skill to take your product and do something with it, right? You described it as hacking around it. And they're basically telling you, like, here's the MVP, right? Here's what I need. Mm-hmm. Just if you make it any bit easier for me, then more people are going to start doing it. More people are going to start doing it. What was the moment where someone noticed it, I guess? Like, speaking of all that, someone had to say, hey, wait, what are these people doing? Because that's not how we designed the product. Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, I'm trying to even remember when, like, I know the team that initially started like leaning into it. Mm-hmm. Where that came from, I think it was in large part we knew we had this intuition that, and we'd seen it in the past where customers are hacking our product on the fringes, that's actually a really good place to look for a new adjacency. Like we knew that to be the case, and actually we even take that approach in how we build, of think about, is there a way that that this can be extended so we can learn from that. Mm-hmm. And so I think someone had the idea of, well, let's like do a real deep dive into what are all the different types of data that's getting sent into the platform. Mm-hmm. And so we actually did that, and like we had to and basically looked at all of the words, literally, that like the text strings that are coming in, to see if we could get any kind of semantic meaning behind that mm-hmm. data. This was one of the things that popped up pretty clearly. It wasn't the only one. We actually saw others, like we saw a lot of people sending in crash data, and that became oh, should we do crash reporting? Mm-hmm. But that was the initial thing that started the thread that you start to pull into a little bit of like, oh, it's interesting, this is happening so frequently. And then, as you said, like, it speaks to there being a really important problem. If someone's going to take the time to hack your solution, it's a clear signal they have a problem. And that's always, like, if you think about why most experiments and most new products fail, it's not because of the technology, right? It comes back to, did you really understand the problem? Yeah. Like, was that a problem that needed to be solved? If a customer literally is hacking your solution, and taking the time to do that, it's clear it's a problem to them. You got to make sure it's a big enough TAM, it's a big enough market for that to make sense. Mm-hmm. But assuming it is, that's a pretty clear signal to go after.
And you talked a little bit about the personas earlier, and the kind of the broad range, I guess, of personas and users that you have. Did the sort of model of experimentation, the folks that were trying to do that, land really squarely in one of those, or is it also distributed? I mean, people experiment in marketing, they experiment in engineering, and they're kind of different problems that I think a lot of organizations solve with the same tools.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was important for us too. So we weren't seeing a lot of marketers mm-hmm. Send us experimentation data, which, if you think about it, actually made sense, because they tended to do a more WYSIWYG kind of front end, lightweight, and so those experiments tend to not be as deep, and where you didn't really need the behavioral data that we have. Whereas it tended to be more engineering PM centric. That was a good thing, because that actually lined up well with who we were focused on. Right. There still was some questions around, okay, this product experimentation is even more end centric than product analytics. Product analytics engineering obviously plays a critical role in it because it's instrumentation, but we tend to have product and data science or analytics tends to be the main kind of user and buyer, whereas experimentation was going to pull us more into the end side. We recognized that, but did talk a lot about that and what that meant for our go-to-market, how we think about selling to customers. So that was part of the consideration, and it should be, right? Because you need to be thinking about all the personas that you can't serve every single persona. Certainly we couldn't at the scale that we were at. Right. So you have to be pretty focused there.
Got it. Well, you've touched on, I mean, right in there, the kind of product engineering, I won't call it boundary, but like overlap and sort of shared responsibilities in there. And then also experimenting to the world of experimentation. Like there's clearly a cultural element at Amplitude that embraces like, let's go explore new areas, let's experiment. So is that something that you've really focused on building into both the product and engineering side? So people are constantly thinking about like you talk about like solving real problems for the customer. I guess just tell me a little bit about how you got to that culture, if it's something that took real emphasis, if it's something you hire for, like how do you think about building that into the team so people are really thinking about learning from customer demand?
Yeah, it's something we actually think a lot about. I think if I think about like what are the core tenets of having that kind of mentality, one is embracing failure, the ability to take risks. I think if anyone who's going to innovate, you have to recognize there's going to be a lot of stuff that doesn't work out. But you have to have that kind of growth mindset. It's actually one of our cultural values is the growth mindset. We actually, our values, we have 3 values for the company. They actually map super well to having innovative culture. It's humility, ownership, and growth mindset. So humility, the ability to recognize when you get it wrong, because like you're going to get things wrong a lot. Yeah. Like that's just part of it. And it's not about whose idea it was or I need to push for my idea. It's like what's right for the customer at the end of the day. So having no ego is an important part of having this kind of experimentation, innovative mindset. Ownership. So one of the other key parts of this is an engineering organization that cares a lot about the customer, very deep into the customer. I actually think that's an important ingredient of innovation. Like at the end of the day, most innovative solutions come from those who are closest to the customer and closest to the technology and the changes that are happening. And so that ends up being a really tight alignment between product, design, engineering. And a lot of times, like a lot of our most innovative solutions have come from that engineer that really understands customer pain, has that customer context, works really closely with PM and design to get that. And so that's a critical piece of it. And even just how we talk about our work. So the way that we talk about the things that we ship, we call them bets. Because we recognize that there's some risk to it, right? There's a payoff that we want to see. But some bets are going to fail. Like it's a bet, like that's by design. Some bets have less risk. Some of them actually, it's pretty clear kind of what the value is, but maybe the upside isn't that great. And some are really big bets. Like this could easily fail. But we want to take that bet because we think the upside is huge. And we'll talk about that. Like it's kind of like taking a VC mindset. Like if you're a VC, you kind of recognize that most of your companies you invest in at the end of the day aren't going to work out. But 1 out of 10 of them are going to give you a 10x return. Product is very similar. Like most things you build aren't going to change the world or change your universe or change your industry or wherever you're working. But like if you can get 10% of them too, that's a massive payout. So you got to create an organization that's willing to place those bets to get that return.
Yeah, I love that financial connection. I mean, I've heard the expression before. I think others use it to talk about delivery as bets or like ideas that they put out or product features, whatever as bets. But I think the thing that's really interesting about it, as I heard you talking about, is I immediately get this. Like, I don't play poker because I'm absolutely garbage at it, but like I get this like almost visceral sense of like, this is how many chips I'm willing to put on this. Like that's how comfortable and confident I am with this idea, and really being forced to think about that and say, we know very, very little about this. We think the space is interesting. I mean, it's less that I'm just sitting at a table with some cards, but like we think the space is interesting, but how cheaply can we try that out? Because we know so little versus, to your point, we're super confident in this one. We're willing to like put a little more behind it because we feel good about it. But that will tell us more and get us more information. We can make a, bigger decision. And, if you use the VC analogy, VCs either continue to invest in future rounds or they don't because they're getting more information as you go, right? Like it's often discussed as a signal, like did they take the pro rata? Did they continue to grow inside the organization or grow with the organization, whatever? Like, are they still seeing from the inside what it looks like from the outside? And that whole notion, like, yes, 1 in 10 of these is actually going to work out and not only pay off, but pay off to cover the other 9. But I don't know which of those 10 it is, right? Like if I knew which one it was, I would just put all the money on that one. That's super easy, right? So really acknowledging like 90% of the time I'm going to be wrong. So how do I build a portfolio approach that allows that? Both of those analogies work really, really well for me. Awesome.
I agree. Build a portfolio approach. And also then how do you get the signal? And that's where analytics and experimentation come in. It can actually give you that early, like more analytics on the earlier side. You're probably not going to experiment when the ideas are super early, but you can actually get good signal. Like, are you getting good retention within that initial feature or product that you're building? Like that's the signal of like, if you're not, dig in more, and then maybe you got to cut bait on that. And honestly, I feel like most companies, the thing that they get wrong is they don't fully comprehend the opportunity cost of continuing to invest behind something that isn't going to win. And a lot of that comes back to ego. It's because it was that leader's idea. They sold it. And so now it's like, they don't want that to fail because they're going to look bad. That's like, that won't work. Honestly, you can't build anyone, like that's where the humility, the lack of ego is so important as part of this.
100%. Well, I'll say 99% because the other thing that I think about in there, like the ego, it's so, I mean, as humans, right? Good leaders, bad leaders, doesn't even matter. Like was consistency principle. Like once we've sort of publicly stated a thing, we want to stay on that track, right? And getting out of that it's hard. It's like real work as a human to kind of break out of that mold. The other thing that I find particularly interesting in software is we're just not as good about thinking about the cost because it is all opportunity cost, right? It's like I am spending my time and energy building a thing when I could be building something else versus if I'm building a house or a bridge or some sort of more classic engineering thing, it's like I could buy this steel or this steel. I can buy this concrete or this concrete, right? Like there's a price tag on every single one of those things. And I have a spreadsheet and I add up the price tag. And I just think and plus we're all terrible at estimation. So I'll like combine all that together. And I think we're unconstrained in an unhelpful way. Like you could do anything. So you have to be much more diligent about this is the thing and this is how much I'm going to do. And my goal is to learn something to decide if I'm going to continue or if I'm going to go somewhere else. And absolutely, I'm going to have analytics. Like now we talk about the design of experiments. Like if we're going to invest at all in this, what's the signal we're looking for? Like we can't just keep going and say, well, we'll know it when we see it. Like if the signal's already there, absolutely go dig into it and don't build anything. But if you're like building something new, what are the metrics we're watching? What do we believe? Like what is our hypothesis? What do we believe is going to move? And if that doesn't move, let's ask some questions before we just go.
I mean, it's taking that scientific approach and defining those pre-mortems ahead of time and how you'll measure success before you get started. Because I guarantee you, if you don't define those before, human nature will lead you to finding data points that will help you tell the narrative you want to tell.
Right.
That's not objective.
Yes.
So you can fight against that human nature by actually doing it before you get started. Defining what success is. And like, sometimes you actually you'll do, like we do that a lot. Like we do that every time. Sometimes we'll learn that actually that wasn't the right way to measure it, but at least then we're having that conversation. So I can go to that product leader and be like, okay, so we didn't hit the metrics, but you're telling me it's because the metric was wrong. I can really dig in to like, okay, why is that the case? So it's not just about us trying to tell a story to make this thing look good. It's like, no, we actually learned that the end value is different. I'm like, oh, well, that's great. That's a learning. Yeah. That's that in itself was like a mini failure and a pivot. And so then, of course, if they're actually building something different, the metric would be different. But we're having that conversation, which is really, really important.
Right. Forcing the checkpoint to say, okay, we thought we were going to get here. We didn't. This is interesting, though. Like, what if we go pursue that for a little bit and run a little experiment around that? Like maybe no one has decided to pay us for this thing, but we have, 10% more users coming in for some reason. Like, okay, let's understand what that is, right? There's a new signal. Now we have new information. Exactly. You might not predict exactly how it's going to go, but you can tell if there's new and useful information that you can then have a real conversation about. Awesome. Well, I love this is like I don't know. Everything that you do as a business is exciting to me because it's like how I want people to think about building products, right? It's so easy, as I said, so unconstrained to like, just start going and then just assume you're right and go and go and go, and having these checkpoints and sort of the ability to like think ahead. Hey, what are we looking for? How are we going to know if this is working? So with all of that background and this clear passion for learning from failure, I'm going to jump into our Red Build Rewind. Can you tell me about a story, like a personal story or experience that you've had that maybe, felt catastrophic in the moment in terms of we'll call it a failure, but ultimately taught you something that's been really helpful or carried you, further on in your career?
Yeah. I mean, I remember my very first job. So I was out of college. I was an econometrician. Mm-hmm. So what that meant was, it's like a data scientist today. We didn't have data science as a term back then. So I would build a bunch of predictive models to try to uncover like what would end up happening in some different like states. So we built this model, and I remember I made a really big mistake in the model that ended up potentially costing our client a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And as you can imagine, when I realized that, stark terror went through my mind. Mm-hmm. But I went to my boss. I was like, oh, well, I found this. This is not good. Yeah, this is not good. The learning actually wasn't the error. The learning was actually how my boss's boss's boss actually approached that. I thought for sure that I was going to get fired, get rung up in front of like the client team. This is and the learning, actually what I observed was he took all of the blame. Mm-hmm. And I was like, at the end, I remember asking myself, like, why did he do that? Like, wasn't on him. We barely even met with him. He's like, well, the reality of this is failure always rolls up to the top. Like the ultimate mm-hmm. at the top is going to be the person most accountable to it. So that's what mm-hmm. a leader does. Mm-hmm. And that was a massive learning for me around mm-hmm. what it means to be a leader, to be an owner. Like at the end of the day, like the ownership starts at the top. And yes, we made a lot of learnings around how to like improve and do better QA and auditing and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And, but the big thing was that I think that set the stage for me around what it means to be an owner, ownership being one of our values. It's something I think a lot about. And anytime anything goes wrong, which stuff goes wrong all the time, obviously, I always think about what could I have done differently as the leader? Because right now I lead a large organization. I always think about myself first. And I think that's something that, I learned honestly there.
Love it. That is such a great lesson. Like what, as a leader, right, as you're saying, what is it I could be doing differently that would change the way people are thinking or operating inside this company to prevent them from sort of running into these kind of situations or give them better safety nets or whatever. The list of stories that end the other way, that start like yours and end the other way with that brand new grad or whatever getting fired as if, obviously you should have known how to do this or whatever is tragically long. And hopefully most of those people then go end up at an organization like the one you were at where there was, a true sense of ownership and leadership. That's awesome. Such a great takeaway. It's such a good thing to be able to carry with you, right? To give you the space to try and learn new things and say, oh, actually it's okay. Like I can, of course I'm going to try to get these things right, but I have the room to take risk and to innovate and to learn. That's great. And then as I grow into a leader, I'm going to model that behavior because I see how valuable it is and impactful to my organization. Love it.
Exactly.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for sharing everything you've explained today. I learned tons. Super excited about, how you're growing and this whole notion of experimenting your way into experimentation. Couldn't be better. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. If you enjoy the podcast, subscribe on your local podcast provider of choice. If there's anyone you want us to talk to or someone or something you want us to hear about, find us on Twitter at CircleCI. Justin, thanks so much again for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. This was great.